serial killers have always fascinated and terrified the public. Over the decades, the United States has seen some of the most infamous killers in criminal history. Some of them hunted for years before they were finally caught. Others managed to hide behind ordinary lives while committing unimaginable crimes. Today, we're looking at 10 of the most notorious serial killers in American history, cases that shocked the country and left a lasting mark on true crime history. Ted Bundy, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Unlike many other killers, Bundy did not appear threatening. He was educated, well-spoken, and often described as charming. He studied psychology and was involved in local political campaigns. To many people, Bundy looked like a young man with a promising future, but behind that image was someone capable of extraordinary violence. During the 1970s, young women began disappearing across several American states: Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado. Many of the victims were college students. Witnesses often reported seeing a polite young man asking for help. Sometimes he pretended to have a broken arm. Sometimes he asked for help carrying books to his car. Once the victims came close enough, Bundy attacked. Investigators later determined that he abducted the women and drove them to remote locations: forests, mountains, isolated roads. For years, police struggled to connect the crimes. The cases were spread across different states, and Bundy moved frequently, making it harder for investigators to track him. In 1975, Bundy was finally arrested in Utah during a traffic stop. Police discovered suspicious items in his car, including handcuffs and burglary tools. At first, investigators could not prove the murders, but they could prove kidnapping. Bundy was convicted. While awaiting trial in Colorado, he did something almost unbelievable. He escaped from custody, not once, but twice. After the second escape, he fled to Florida, where his crimes became even more violent. In January 1978, Bundy attacked a sorority house at Florida State University. 2 women were murdered. Several others were injured. The attack shocked the entire country. Just weeks later, Bundy was arrested again. This time, the evidence against him was overwhelming. In 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. Years later, he admitted responsibility for at least 30 killings. Investigators believe the real number may have been even higher. In 1989, Bundy was executed in Florida. His case remains one of the most notorious serial murder investigations in American history, because the man responsible did not look like a monster. He looked like someone you might trust. John Wayne Gacy, one of the most disturbing serial killers in American history. To his neighbors, Gacy looked like a successful and respected member of the community. He owned a construction business in suburban Chicago. He was involved in local politics. He attended charity events and community gatherings. Gacy was known for another unusual detail. At children's parties and local events, he sometimes dressed as a clown. The character was called Pogo the Clown. To many people, he appeared friendly, outgoing, even entertaining. But behind that public image was a completely different reality. During the 1970s, young men and teenage boys in the Chicago area began disappearing. Many of them had something in common. They had last been seen near Gacy's home or had worked for his construction company. Gacy often targeted vulnerable young men. Sometimes he offered them work. Sometimes he promised easy money. Once they were inside his house, the situation changed. Investigators later learned that Gacy used manipulation and intimidation to control his victims. The murders took place inside his home. Afterward, he hid the bodies beneath the house in the crawl space. For years, no one suspected the truth. But by the late 1970s, police began to notice a pattern. Several missing persons investigations pointed in the same direction. Eventually, detectives obtained a search warrant for Gacy's house. What they discovered shocked even experienced investigators. Beneath the house, they began finding human remains, one body after another. In total, authorities recovered the remains of 33 victims, The scale of the crimes horrified the entire country. John Wayne Gacy was arrested in December 1978. During questioning, he eventually confessed. In 1980, he was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. Years later, in 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His case remains one of the most infamous serial murder cases in American history, because the man responsible had spent years hiding in plain sight, behind the smile of a clown. Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most disturbing serial killers in American history. Unlike some other killers, Dahmer did not hide behind charisma or public success. He was quiet, socially isolated, often described by neighbors as strange but harmless. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dahmer lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From the outside, his life appeared uneventful, but inside his small apartment, a series of horrific crimes was unfolding. Dahmer targeted young men, many of whom he met in bars, clubs, or on the street. He often offered money in exchange for simple favors, sometimes just to take photographs. Once inside his apartment, the situation changed. Investigators later discovered that Dahmer used manipulation and drugs to control his victims. The murders took place inside that apartment. Afterward, he attempted to conceal the evidence inside the room. For years, his crimes went unnoticed. Even when neighbors complained about strange smells coming from the apartment, no one suspected the truth. But in July 1991, everything changed. One of Dahmer's intended victims managed to escape. He ran into the street and found police officers. When officers entered Dahmer's apartment, they quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Inside, they discovered photographs, human remains, and other evidence of multiple murders. The scale of the crimes shocked investigators. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested immediately. During interrogation, he confessed to killing 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. In 1992, Dahmer was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison. But his story did not end there. In 1994, while serving his sentence, Dahmer was killed by another inmate inside the prison. His crimes remain some of the most infamous in American criminal history, because they revealed how unimaginable violence could remain hidden for years behind the door of an ordinary apartment. Gary Ridgway, known to investigators as the Green River Killer. Ridgway became one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. For years, he appeared to live a quiet and ordinary life. He worked as a truck painter at a manufacturing plant near Seattle. Co-workers described him as quiet, somewhat socially awkward, but otherwise unremarkable. No one around him suspected that he was responsible for one of the largest serial murder investigations in the United States. In the early 1980s, young women began disappearing in the Seattle area. Many of them were runaways or sex workers. Their bodies were later discovered near the Green River, a wooded area south of the city. At first, investigators believed they were dealing with isolated cases, but as the number of victims grew, police realized something far more disturbing was happening. A serial killer was operating in the area. Ridgway used a simple but effective method. He would pick up vulnerable women along highways and city streets. He appeared calm and non-threatening. Once the victims entered his vehicle, he drove them to isolated locations outside the city. Most of the murders took place in remote wooded areas. The bodies were left in forests or near rivers, making them difficult to find. For years, investigators struggled to identify the killer. The Green River investigation became one of the largest in U.S. history. Hundreds of detectives worked on the case. Thousands of suspects were questioned, and yet the murders continued. Ironically, Gary Ridgway himself was interviewed by police during the investigation, but at the time, there was not enough evidence to arrest him. The breakthrough came many years later. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to re-examine old evidence. DNA collected from crime scenes was tested again. This time, the results led directly to Ridgway. He was arrested in 2001. During questioning, Ridgway eventually confessed to dozens of murders. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder in order to avoid the death penalty. Gary Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Investigators believe he may be responsible for even more victims. His case remains one of the most extensive serial murder investigations ever conducted in the United States. And for years, the man responsible lived an ordinary life, while one of the largest manhunts in American history unfolded around him. Dennis Rader, known to the public as the BTK Killer. The name came from the method he used during his crimes: bind, torture, kill. For years, the BTK case terrified the city of Wichita, Kansas. But what made the story even more disturbing was the identity of the man behind the crimes. Dennis Rader lived what appeared to be a completely ordinary life. He was a husband, a father, an active member of his local church. Later in life, he even worked as a compliance officer for the city, enforcing local regulations. To neighbors and colleagues, Rader seemed strict but responsible. No one suspected that he was responsible for a series of brutal murders. The crimes began in 1974. Rader targeted families and individuals living in quiet suburban neighborhoods. He often studied his victims beforehand, watching their homes, learning their routines. Once he chose a target, he broke into the house and waited. When the victims returned, he took control of the situation. Over the years, the BTK Killer murdered 10 people. But what made the case especially unusual was Rader's desire for attention. He sent letters to newspapers and police. In those letters, he described the crimes and demanded recognition. For decades, the identity of BTK remained unknown. The murders stopped in the early 1990s, and many investigators believed the killer might be dead or imprisoned for another crime. Then, in 2004, something unexpected happened. The BTK Killer contacted the media again. He began sending new letters and messages to the police, but this time, he made a mistake. Rader sent a digital file to investigators. When forensic specialists analyzed the metadata, they traced it back to a computer used at a local church. And that church had a familiar member: Dennis Rader. He was arrested in 2005. During interrogation, Rader calmly confessed to the murders. Later that year, he pleaded guilty in court. Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences. Today, he remains in prison. His case is remembered not only for the brutality of the crimes, but for the chilling fact that the killer lived among his neighbors for decades. A man who looked like a normal member of the community, while secretly carrying the identity of BTK. Richard Ramirez, known to the public as the Night Stalker. In the mid-1980s, Los Angeles was gripped by fear. A series of violent attacks was spreading across the city. The victims were different ages, different backgrounds, different neighborhoods. At first, investigators struggled to understand the pattern, but soon it became clear that the crimes were connected. One man was responsible. Unlike some other serial killers, Ramirez did not try to appear normal or respectable. He lived a chaotic life, moving between cheap motels and apartments, spending much of his time wandering the streets at night. That is how he chose his victims. Ramirez often entered homes while people were sleeping, windows left open, unlocked doors, quiet residential streets. Once inside, he attacked the residents of the house. The crimes were unpredictable. Sometimes he targeted couples, sometimes entire families. This randomness made the investigation extremely difficult. The attacks continued throughout 1984 and 1985. As the number of victims grew, the media began calling the killer the Night Stalker. The name quickly spread across California. Residents began locking doors and windows earlier than ever before. Neighborhood watch groups formed. The entire city felt on edge. Eventually, investigators recovered a key piece of evidence from one of the crime scenes: a fingerprint. Using police databases, detectives were finally able to identify a suspect. The name matched a man already known to law enforcement: Richard Ramirez. In August 1985, Ramirez was recognized by members of the public in East Los Angeles. A group of residents surrounded him before police arrived. When officers took him into custody, the long manhunt finally ended. In 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. He spent the rest of his life on death row in California. Ramirez died in prison in 2013. His crimes left a lasting impact on Los Angeles, because for more than a year, an entire city had lived with the same terrifying thought: that the killer could strike anywhere, in any home, on any night. Samuel Little. For decades, his name was almost unknown, but investigators would later identify him as the most prolific serial killer in American history. Little lived a transient life, moving from city to city across the United States. He rarely stayed in one place for long. Most people who encountered him saw nothing unusual. He appeared quiet, sometimes even friendly, but behind that ordinary appearance was someone responsible for dozens of murders. Little targeted vulnerable women. Many of them were living on the margins of society. Some struggled with addiction. Some were homeless. Others were involved in street-level sex work. These circumstances made the crimes easier to hide. When victims disappeared, their cases often received little attention. Little used a simple method. He approached women in bars or on the street. After gaining their trust, he drove them to secluded locations. Most of the murders involved strangulation, because it left few obvious traces. The crimes began in the 1970s, and they continued for decades, across multiple states. For years, police departments investigated the cases separately, without realizing that the same person might be responsible. Samuel Little was arrested several times during his life for different crimes, but the murders remained unsolved. The breakthrough came in 2012. Little was arrested in Kentucky on drug charges. During the investigation, detectives collected a DNA sample. That sample matched evidence from several unsolved murder cases. Little was extradited to California, and during questioning, he began confessing. Investigators soon realized the scale of the crimes was far larger than expected. Samuel Little eventually confessed to 93 murders committed between 1970 and 2005. The FBI later confirmed many of those confessions, making Little the most prolific serial killer officially identified in the United States. In 2014, he was sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison. Samuel Little died in prison in 2020. For decades, his crimes went unnoticed, because his victims were often people society overlooked, and because the man responsible was able to move quietly from one city to the next, leaving behind a trail of unsolved cases across the country. David Berkowitz, known to the public as the son of Sam. In the summer of 1976, a series of shootings began in New York City. The attacks seemed random. Victims were often young couples sitting in parked cars. The shootings took place late at night, in quiet neighborhoods. At first, investigators struggled to connect the crimes. But as more victims appeared, police realized they were dealing with a serial attacker. The media soon gave him a name: the Son of Sam. The name came from letters the killer sent to the police and newspapers. In those letters, he described the crimes and mocked investigators. The messages quickly attracted national attention. Fear spread throughout New York. People avoided parks and empty streets at night. Couples were afraid to sit in their cars. The city felt under constant threat. David Berkowitz lived an ordinary life in Yonkers, just outside New York City. He worked various jobs and kept a low profile. Few people suspected he could be responsible for the crimes that were terrifying the city. But investigators eventually discovered an important clue: a parking ticket. Near one of the crime scenes, police found a ticket issued to a car registered to Berkowitz. Detectives began investigating the owner of the vehicle. The evidence quickly began to connect. In August 1977, police surrounded Berkowitz outside his apartment building. He was arrested without resistance. Inside his car, officers found a rifle similar to the one used in the shootings. During interrogation, Berkowitz confessed. He admitted responsibility for a series of attacks that left several people dead and others seriously injured. In 1978, he was convicted and sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison. David Berkowitz remains incarcerated today. His crimes left a lasting impact on New York City, because for more than a year, millions of people lived with the fear that the son of Sam could strike again, at any moment, on any quiet street. Aileen Wuornos, one of the most well-known female serial killers in American history. Her story was very different from many other killers. Wuornos had an extremely difficult childhood. She grew up in poverty, experienced abuse, and spent much of her youth moving between foster homes and unstable living situations. As an adult, she struggled to survive. She often lived on the streets and worked as a sex worker along highways in Florida. During the late 1980s, a series of murders began along the highways of Central Florida. The victims were men. Most of them had been shot and left near remote roads or wooded areas. At first, investigators did not immediately connect the cases, but as the number of victims grew, police realized that the murders were linked. Aileen Wuornos became the primary suspect after witnesses and evidence connected her to the victims' vehicles. She was arrested in January 1991. During interrogation, Wuornos confessed to the shootings. She claimed that the men had attempted to assault her and that she acted in self-defense. However, investigators believe the killings followed a different pattern. The case quickly became one of the most widely discussed criminal trials in the United States. In 1992, Wuornos was convicted of murder. She received multiple death sentences. Her case attracted enormous media attention, partly because female serial killers are extremely rare, and partly because of the tragic background that shaped her life. In 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Her story remains one of the most controversial and debated serial killer cases in American history, because it raised difficult questions about violence, about trauma, and about how a life shaped by hardship can eventually lead to tragedy. Joseph James DeAngelo. For decades, his identity remained one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. The man responsible for a long series of crimes became known by several names: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and later, the Golden State Killer. Between the mid-1970s and the 1980s, dozens of violent crimes were reported across California. Homes were broken into during the night. Couples were attacked while sleeping. The killer moved silently through quiet suburban neighborhoods, often entering homes through unlocked doors or windows. What made the crimes especially disturbing was the level of planning. Investigators believed the attacker carefully studied his victims beforehand. He watched neighborhoods, learned routines, and waited for the right moment. For years, the crimes continued across multiple counties, but despite extensive investigations, the killer was never identified. The trail eventually went cold. Many people believed the Golden State Killer had either died or stopped committing crimes. The truth would not emerge for decades. Joseph James DeAngelo had once worked as a police officer in California. He understood how investigations worked. He knew how to avoid leaving evidence. And he knew how police searched for suspects. This knowledge helped him evade capture for more than 40 years. The breakthrough finally came in 2018. Investigators used a new method of DNA analysis. They uploaded crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database. Using distant relatives and family trees, detectives were able to narrow down possible suspects. Eventually, the evidence pointed to one man: Joseph James DeAngelo. He was arrested at his home in California. By that time, he was living quietly in retirement. In 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to multiple crimes, including several murders. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The arrest closed one of the longest-running investigations in American criminal history, a case that had remained unsolved for more than 4 decades, and a reminder that sometimes even the most elusive criminals can eventually be found. These cases remind us that some of the most dangerous people can hide behind ordinary lives. For years, many of these killers managed to avoid suspicion while their crimes continued, but eventually, the truth came out, and their stories became part of criminal history. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below.